Hello, and thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to be talking about the role of creativity in ensuring that science has real-world impact. I hope that we all appreciate how much the creative arts enhance our lives. These are pictures of some of my family members who are truly creative. I love what they do. But creative science? I don't know. Throughout my career, I've used participatory methods to conduct research in partnership with marginalized communities. I truly believe that inclusion increases the impact of research, both directly by making sure, for example, that we're studying the right questions and that we're implementing and disseminating our findings effectively, and indirectly by increasing scientific rigor. For example, by improving our data collection instruments or increasing the representativeness of our samples. That being said, I have to say I feel a little bit intimidated by the idea of presenting at a conference on creativity. Sure, you can say that using a participatory research approach with autistic adults is creative. I mean, when I first suggested it 15 years ago, a lot of people seemed to think it was a ludicrous idea. But come on, being that participatory research methods have been around since the mid-20th century and that we've been successfully partnering with autistic adults since 2006, the notion that participatory research in and of itself is creative is kind of sad. So today I'm going to focus on the need for creative solutions. Specifically, I'm going to focus on two main areas. One, what it takes to walk the walk on inclusion, and two, how sometimes challenging the rules can in fact increase the scientific rigor of research. So let's start with walking the talk on inclusion. I co-founded Aspire in 2006 with Dora Rainmaker. Dora started out as my community partner, but she has since crossed over to the dark side and is now leading her own research studies as a PhD-trained, externally funded principal investigator. We still co-direct Aspire, though, and work really closely together on all our Aspire projects. Aspire uses a community-based research approach, or CBPR. That means that academic and community partners serve as equal partners throughout every phase of our research. In addition to autistic scientists such as Dora, we have a dozen other autistic individuals with diverse personal and disability-related characteristics on our team. We also include other stakeholders such as family members, disability services professionals, and healthcare providers. We're primarily based in the United States, but we have some team members in the UK and Australia and are hoping to grow internationally. Our current projects focus on healthcare, employment, autistic burnout, and outcome measurement. I don't have time to talk today about most of our actual research, but I'll be giving a few examples from our newest research project on measuring outcomes. The goal of the project is to understand what outcomes are most important to measure when evaluating services for autistic adults and to figure out how we can best measure them. About a year and a half ago, we received a very large 5-year grant from the National Institute of Mental Health. We're currently creating what we call the OTPROM Toolbox, a set of accessible patient-reported outcome measures for use with autistic adults. We will then rigorously test the toolbox in settings where services are likely to be delivered. Ultimately, we plan to make the measures widely and freely available to researchers and service providers. Now, I could talk for hours about the details of how we work together to create an effective and equitable partnership, but I only get 20 minutes. So if you want to learn more, you can read the 3 sets of guidelines that came out of an institutional ethnography of our work from 2006 to 2019. You can also use our collaboration toolkit available on our website that includes all sorts of sample materials from our research projects and some longer, more practical webinars. We have some interns who will be reorganizing the site and putting a lot more material on it this summer, so check back again in the fall. I feel like it's extremely important to be transparent about what approach you're using and to not pretend you're doing something you aren't. There are many forms of participatory research. Some treat community partners as advisors, others as co-researchers. CBPR aims to have community partners serve as equal partners. So what does it take to actually have academic and community members serve as equal partners? Most importantly, it takes a true commitment to equal power sharing, not just here and there, but from when the project is just an idea all the way to when you're disseminating the results and everything in between. And then it takes a lot of work to clearly define roles and expectations, to understand and meet people's accessibility needs, to build, and more importantly, to maintain trust. And the truth is, no matter how hard you try, there's always room for improvement. We're continuously evaluating our collaboration with quick little keep change exercises at the end of each meeting, an ongoing online survey where team members can provide anonymous feedback, and bigger in-depth evaluations when we meet project milestones. 15 years into it, you would think we had this all down pat, but the truth is we're constantly tweaking our collaboration processes to make them better. Let me give you a few examples of challenges to walking the talk. And some of the solutions that have worked for us. Some of these things may seem kind of boring and trivial, but in CBPR, the success of the partnership often really depends on these little details. Take, for example, email communications. We often have to share large amounts of information over email. Our team purposefully is made up of people with very different backgrounds and skills, and different team members may have greater interest in some of the details or more time available than others. It can be challenging to meet our goal of transparency without totally overwhelming people on the team. One of the solutions we've come up with is to use a structured email format. Emails start with clearly marked sections with information about the purpose of the message, what actions we expect, the deadline, and if there's a stipend for this action. Then there's a brief summary of the main points, followed by the rest of the details in question and answer format and plain language. We also make sure to clearly mark optional sections or attachments that may have even more detailed or technical information for those who want to see it. The next challenge has been about holding group meetings. Since our inception in 2006, we've had a geographically dispersed group, many partners with auditory processing difficulties, and some that are non-speaking. Clearly, we can't use things like telephones. Our first solution was to hold our meetings as text-only real-time meetings through instant messenger chats. That may not seem like a big deal now, but believe me, in 2006, it really felt that way. We learned to make meetings work by sharing very detailed preparation materials in advance, providing strong facilitation, and creating clear chat etiquettes. That worked really well for 14 years with regular team meetings every other week during the active parts of all of our research. But then, about a year and a half ago, we greatly expanded our team, bringing on new community partners who cannot participate in text, as well as a lot of new academic partners. This all required a different solution and a lot of work to find something that worked for everyone on our diverse team. We now use a mix of slides, video, text chat, and professional real-time closed captioning. We have several staff and students who help facilitate, and we've come up with guides to avoid the feeling like there's two meetings going on at once, one using speech and another in the chat box. We've also learned, kind of the hard way, to send preparation materials in 3 different formats, one for people who prefer lots of detail, one for those who need easy read materials, and one for those who only have time to look at the most important points in a compact version. People can read these materials on their own, or they can review them in an optional pre-meeting. We also found that some people were really interested in the technical aspects of the research, whether they were academic or community partners. Sometimes it would be hard to keep the conversation accessible to everyone in the group. So we created another optional meeting the week in between the full team meetings, where autistic and non-autistic, quote, survey geeks can discuss technical stuff to their heart's content, making it easier to center community voices and lived experience in the full team meetings. A really common challenge in CBPR is how to actually make sure that you're making shared decisions. The truth is, no matter how nice we all are, we have different levels of power in different communication styles. And with a relatively small team, each person may represent an important part of the community. Simply voting on things and going by what the majority thinks is just not okay. For example, if something doesn't work for one community partner, it may not work for a large swath of potential participants. So we have long used a formal consensus process. Our little 5-finger process is pictured here, but there are plenty of other ones out there. These things make sure that everyone has a say, encourage just creative solutions to problems, and help speed up the process when more discussion isn't necessary, or makes us take more time when it really is needed. This past year, we had another brand new challenge. We needed input from a wide variety of experts outside of our own nice, trusting, comfortable CBPR team. It made sense to use a traditional, quote, modified Delphi process to get input and reach agreement from lots of experts. However, this process is usually very researcher driven. So we created a new method we're calling a, quote, nested Delphi process. We brought together 29 panelists who are academic researchers, community leaders, and leaders from the services systems. As is typical, we held 4 rounds of the Delphi process, but our full Aspire CBPR team met between each round to make sure that the next round of surveys and information we gave to the Delphi panelists was accessible and complete, and to use the results of each round to make decisions collaboratively. We're very excited to reach full consensus on that final list of outcomes to include in our toolbox with all the Delphi panelists and our whole CBPR team. So before I move on to the next section, I wanted to take a moment to step outside of the nuts and bolts of conducting participatory research to talking about our efforts to include autistic people in the peer-reviewed literature. About 3.5 years ago, I was asked to be editor-in-chief of a new journal, Autism in Adulthood, that focuses on the most pressing issues affecting autistic adults. Before I said yes, I warned our publishers that if I was EIC, my deep commitment to inclusion would make the journal a bit unusual. Luckily, they were totally supportive, and my partner in crime, Dora Raymaker, agreed to be the associate editor. In addition to Dora, we have 10 autistic people in the editorial board, and many family members and clinicians. We have a strong anti-ableist language policy and a creative peer review process. Like other journals, every manuscript gets at least 2 traditional scientific peer reviews. If at least one of those scientific reviews comes from an autistic scientist, great. That's not often the case. So if not, it also gets an additional review by an autistic adult to make sure it's relevant, important, and respectful. We also have an insights section in each regular issue for memoir-style essays by autistic people. Finally, I'm pleased to say that so far, approximately 1/3 of the papers we've published include at least one autistic author, which may not seem high, but it's so much higher than the overall literature in autism. I hope we continue to improve. So, okay, now let's switch to the need to sometimes challenge the rules. Growing up in an immigrant family in the United States, I was always well aware of the existence of different rules in my family's home than that of my peers. Now, as an internal medicine physician and a health services researcher, I often feel like an immigrant to the world of autism research. And I have to say, as an outsider, I'm sometimes struck by the bizarrely rigid thinking autism researchers sometimes have about the, quote, rules of research, as well as this fear of what reviewers will say. But when it comes down to it, we're all in a brand new world, our emerging field of research on autism in adulthood. And as we create our new world, I hope we can think critically about the reason for rules, and that we always aim to match our rules, methods, methodologies, and paradigms to the goals of each project. So I'm going to offer a few examples where we've challenged the traditional rules and have successfully convinced ethics boards, grant funding agencies, and peer reviewers that breaking the rules of traditional autism research may make our work more rigorous, ethical, and impactful. In many cases, it's really important for research to use representative samples of the population. However, there just isn't a good practical way to obtain a representative sample of the entire population of autistic adults. Many of the strategies used in research with autistic children just don't apply to adulthood. And each systematic sampling strategy creates its own biases. So our outcomes project is recruiting 3 separate cohorts. One systematically recruited from the healthcare system, another systematically recruited from government-run disability services systems, and a convenient sample from the community. The point is that we need to make sure our instruments work well in all 3 settings. This will allow us to understand the expected distributions for our measures in each cohort and also make sure that we're creating practical, useful tools. The most steadfast rule seems to be that you must re-ascertain participants' autism diagnoses as part of inclusion criteria, certainly by doing an ADOS, but in a worst case scenario, by at least using a screener such as the AQ. So now, This is a totally reasonable expectation in some types of research in order to avoid misclassification bias. For example, if you're trying to compare how autistic and non-autistic brains function, it is important to make sure that the autistic sample is really autistic. And we know clinical diagnoses can be widely variable. However, just because a rule makes sense for one project doesn't mean we should overgeneralize it to all research. Even leaving aside the limited information we have as to the utility of the ADOS in adults, I would argue that in some contexts, using the ADOS as part of your inclusion criteria would make your sample less representative. For example, if you're trying to study an intervention within the vocational rehabilitation system, the target population is people eligible for voc rehab services. Limiting your research sample to those that happen to have a high ADOS score would bias your sample and make it less generalizable to the population it's supposed to target. When we were designing our new Aspire Outcomes project, I heard from several people that the NIH would never allow a large multi-million-dollar R01 study to, quote, get away without doing an ADOS on all participants. But I argued that it's not getting away with sloppy methods, it's matching the sample to the target populations. In our project, we want to make sure the samples represent the various contexts where autistic adults may receive services. So we're using different inclusion criteria for each of our 3 cohorts. In the health system, participants must have an ICD-10 code related to autism in their medical records. In the disability services system, they must qualify for government services with a diagnosis of autism. And in the community sample, they must simply self-identify as autistic. So luckily, I work at 2 institutions, both of which have ethics boards, or IRBs as we call them, with very thoughtful, open-minded chairs. I have many colleagues, however, who are told that they must follow rules that don't make sense. And their ethics boards are interpreting national guidelines in ways that actually potentially decrease the ethics of our research. Examples include the requirements that autistic community partners often offer consent. Team members are not study participants, and requiring them to offer consent disrespects their roles as researchers. Others are told that all autistic participants must be assessed for decisional impairment. While we certainly do assess for decisional impairment in certain situations, blanket rules like that are offensive and unnecessary. Similarly, in some situations, written signed consent unnecessarily increases participant burden and is no better than verbal or online consent. And finally, that part of the consent form with a bunch of legal gobbledygook, yes, it may say that you're not allowed to change that language, but that's a lie. We have successfully argued that this language decreases accessibility and thus harms the integrity of the informed consent process. Our community partners have helped us create much more accessible consent forms that better meet the ethical principles that ethics boards abide by. I'm also struck by researchers' extreme hesitancy to change, quote, validated survey instruments, even when these instruments have not been validated with populations of autistic adults. Sorry to say this, but that wonderful psychometric data you have doesn't apply if it was collected on a different population. Our community partners have reviewed countless survey instruments validated in general populations or with parents of autistic children and have found most of them to be inaccessible. They felt that if they had to use these instruments, they would experience significant confusion, frustration, anxiety, or anger, and stated that they would offer unreliable answers, leave many items blank, or stop participating in the study. Ultimately, we know that incomplete or bad data leads to the wrong conclusions and ineffective efforts. Over the years, we've used our CVPR process to adapt many instruments to be accessible to autistic adults. And of course, we've then needed to reassess the instrument's psychometric properties. We're right in the middle of adapting many more instrument outcome measures right now. We'll evaluate them in a real-world longitudinal cohort with multiple repeated measures. We'll assess their reliability and validity and their expected distributions in each of our 3 subcohorts. We'll also use longitudinal growth curve analysis to assess responsiveness to change and factors predicting change. And we'll combine that quantitative data with a narrative analysis of qualitative data to compare change in scores to participants' own stories about how their lives have changed. Finally, just to make it clear that that it's not just quantitative rules that need to be challenged, Years ago, when we first started doing qualitative research with autistic adults, we got a lot of pushback from reviewers about collecting data in alternative formats or multiple formats. We were and continue to offer participants the choice of taking part in person or via video, telephone, text-based chat, or email. We've successfully argued and truly believe that you need to offer multiple modes in order to increase the diversity and inclusivity of the sample. In this way, you're going to get richer data, not lower quality data. Oh, and this last comment is targeted just to the autistic researchers in the audience, but if you happen to be reviewing qualitative research, please note that most high quality qualitative research doesn't use positivist or post-positive paradigms, so please don't ask for things like measures of inter-rater reliability or statements about generalizability. So I'm out of time, but let me quickly offer some take-home messages. Participatory approaches can help strengthen the rigor and impact of research, but good intentions alone are not enough. It takes creative solutions, humility, and a lot of work to walk the talk about participatory research. Research methods need to match the study's goals, methodology, and paradigms. Sometimes traditional autism research rules make the research less rigorous. Think critically and creatively about your research, and let's all work together to ensure that all autism research is respectful, anti-ableist, rigorous, and impactful. A big thank you to our Aspire team members, past and present, as well as to our funders. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions in the Q&A period. Thanks.